Hi there. So I recently got a good inquiry question that we can contemplate from many different perspectives. So first, let's consider what inquiry is. It's a form of contemplation where we enter without knowing the answer. Okay, and the purpose isn't so much to find a definitive answer; it's more of an exploratory type of process. For example, we might ask, what is a thought? And rather than assuming I know what a thought is, you enter not knowing, okay, which is kind of backwards in our society. Society often values knowing things, and if you don't know something, it might be uncomfortable, you might look stupid. But in this context, not knowing is good. So we go in not knowing, okay, and we also don't want to figure things out. Like a thought is this and come up with a particular definition. We want to have an open mind where insights might arise, there might be appearances. It's a state of curiosity, of openness, where there might be some thoughts, there might be some images, maybe it's some of that. Okay, so I'm gonna give the question, and then we're gonna go prior to the question and look at what some of our assumptions will be, and then we'll start looking into the question. So the question has to do with memory and sensing, which is interesting areas of inquiry. So the question is memory dependent only on our senses? Can someone without any senses, such as touch, smell, sight, hearing, taste, form any memories? So now, if we made assumptions that we know what memory is, like everybody knows what memory is, right? That's going to be limiting. If we go in with the assumption, like I know what sensing is, that's going to be limiting as well. So I like to go prior to a question and ask, like, what's the foundation of this question first? So what is sensing? So I would go in with the idea, like, I don't know what sensing is. And then I would watch my mind, I would watch my experience, I would observe of like, okay, well, is that sensing? Well, I guess there's lots of different forms of sensing. Is it interrelated? And then you can start to create constructs of what sensing is. So similar with memory. If I go in, or someone goes in thinking like, well, memory is, well, everybody knows that. It's very simple, right? But no, it's not. If you really go into like the nuances of what it is, it's not a simple definition or thing to pin down. So going prior to that, it'd be just a curiosity of like, what is memory, right? Are there different forms of memory? And then just watching the mind and observing of like, oh, okay, that's a memory. You can start going deeper with it. And there's many different ways and forms of memory. So I'm going to start off, because we need a little bit of structure to get into kind of the meat of this question. So, but I want to start off just by saying that there's a lot of places we could go with memory, and there's different, and sensing, and there's a lot of different like constructs we could create of what it is. So I'm going to offer some grounding, but I'm not saying that's the only definition of memory. Like, but we need to create some structure just to get started, like some foundation. So if you're like, well, wait a minute, that's not like memory, or that's not a sense of self, or there is no past. So a lot of the terms that I'm using, if you've come from a place of like a spiritual place where the term is used differently, that's fine. Like I would be like, sure, let's go with that and let's explore that. Okay, so everything I'm constructing here is not the definitive. Okay, it's one explanation or one exploration, but there are many other explorations that we could take, okay, as well. So of the two, sensing and memory, I think memory is a little bit more straightforward, okay? And I'm gonna start with something that's most people are kind of familiar with. Like what's kind of like just the mainstream, regular idea of memory, okay? So I'm gonna give a couple different forms. So one I would say is a subconscious form of memory that we're not consciously aware of, reflecting, and paying attention to. Okay, so that would be something like you're riding your bicycle in your hometown, and you're not thinking about uh, directions like where's the store, where's my home, should I make a left turn or a right turn? Okay, because you've already learned and have a background memory, like a mind map. You have a map and you just automatically can ride your bicycle, you go to the park, you go to the store, like you ride home, and you're not consciously thinking about that. Similarly, if you meet a friend or a family member, you're not consciously thinking like, oh, this person and I have this. You just know who they are because that's been implanted in your mind and it's in the background. Okay, so that form of memory where there's an initial exposure, there's kind of a map that's formed that's in the subconscious and the background. That's not unique to humans. Okay, so if you observe other animals, it looks like they have that ability of memory. So, for example, I watch squirrels in my backyard. They have a mind map of where their favorite trees are, where how to get into my garage, right? But they're not thinking about it. It's just in their background, but they have a memory. So if we put an animal or yourself in a totally new environment, you wouldn't have that memory map and you would have to get oriented. But then once you have that map, you wouldn't need to put any effort into it. It would just become automatic. Okay? Similarly with dogs, they would be able to recognize and have a form of memory of people that they meet. Okay? Another form of memory, which looks like it's only for humans, is a more sophisticated type of story that we might form, where we create this construct of a past and present. So, for example, you might be with family and you're reminiscing about memories you had, a family vacation from years ago. Okay? So that memory processing is happening now in the moment, but it's contextualized as if something had happened in the past that you're recalling and you're remembering. And so we can say, let's just assume that there is a past, okay? So with this form of memory where we're consciously creating and thinking about it, aspects of it may have happened in the past, aspects might not have. So there's been a lot of experiments and studies that humans do not have a very accurate form of memory over different experiences that they've had. So there's memory degradation. We add in some things like, oh yeah, like it was sunny at the time, or there were a lot of people there when there weren't as many. So the memories aren't that accurate over time. Okay? As well, as we get older, especially, but not necessarily old, especially for people that are older, they can start adding in a whole bunch of new stuff. So someone that's old, for example, they might talk about memories where like half of it didn't happen, right? So one thing with my like grandmother, she would talk about these memories of like that when she was in high school, she was like in a choir and like traveling in the choir, and like she traveled through Europe like in this choir, and all these things that like she did in Europe. And my mom would tell me like there's nuggets of truth to that. There was a small time with a choir, but the rest of it is like new creations. So one thing about memory is it didn't necessarily need to happen. Okay, so we can create memories that are happening in the moment that didn't necessarily actually happen or happen very accurately like we believe they did. Okay, so now let's consider what is so now we're going to get into like senses and what it would be like for people like without senses. So let's first consider what's the minimal amount that's required for a memory. Okay, so sometimes before we get into the complexities, it's nice to deconstruct things and just melt it down and say, what is the minimal amount that would be necessary for this phenomena to take place? Okay, so let's rewind and deconstruct to nothing, just to emptiness, where there's no contrast of everything. It's just a null void, nothing. Okay? So there's no awareness, there's no person, there's no things, it's just a void. Okay? In that environment, there's no distinction between two different things, and hence you wouldn't be able to have a memory, because to create a memory, there's got to be at least a distinction. Okay? Because if you have any memory, what that thing is not some other thing. So it has to be something distinct from another thing. Okay? So if it's a memory of being in a choir, right, that's not a ham sandwich. Okay? That's not touching a hot stove. That's not the color purple. Okay? So that would be a thing that's distinct from another thing. Okay? So if there was a null void of absolute nothing, you can't create any distinctions because there's no thing that's separate from another thing. Okay? So that would be the minimal amount, is that there has to be a difference, a thing that appears, and second, there has to be some form of awareness of that. So even if there was a distinction, but there was no awareness of that, then that doesn't count, right? So if you're hiking through the woods and there's an event, there's a difference or something that happened, but you're not aware of it, right? That's not going to register in the mind, okay? So the minimal requirement is we would have to form a distinction, okay? That there is something that's different than another thing, and there's got to be awareness of that thing, okay? So now let's go back to the question, okay, and first ask, would that be possible for someone without the five senses? So rather than saying touch, smell, sight, hearing, taste over and over, I'm just going to say the five main senses. And we'll just first stick with that, okay, because I think there's a lot to explore with that, okay? And then I'm going to expand, okay, kind of the arena of the exploration, okay? So if someone without any of the senses, if we're saying that they have no senses at all, know nothing, there's a null void, then in terms of this exploration, it would be game over for me of what the construct I'm creating. Then we would, because we would be at the place of like a rock, right? Where there's just nothing there and no awareness, okay? We could still explore the idea of memory, but that gets into something very different, and it would get more into like quantum mechanics and way out there on metaphysics, which I think would be interesting explorations, but not kind of what I'm creating here. Okay, so we're going to make the assumption that someone without, an entity without these senses, our five main senses, there is still a thing that can appear, so it's not a null void, and there's a certain amount of awareness, right? To that is aware of that, okay? To move forward, okay? So next, if we're going to consider okay, so it's all tricky because we're so conditioned through our dominant senses, the five senses. So it's very difficult to imagine what it's going to be like, okay, without that. And that's kind of the next point that we have to accept, is that we are trying to consider something that is really difficult to imagine, that's way outside of our conditioned consciousness and how we perceive reality and how we've been conditioned through our lifetime, okay? That's not to say that we might get some insights and maybe get some hints, but it is to say the actuality of what that would be like to have no senses your entire lifetime and right now would be extremely difficult, okay? So it would be similar to asking, like, what would it be like to be a bat? Like the bats that fly in caves, okay? That's very different than our consciousness. I mean, they've got like sonar, right? And stuff, and it would be just a very difficult thing to really get a direct experience of what it would be like to be a bat, okay? Another way that you could consider this would be, like, we're going to play, it would be like asking, what was it like before you were born? Okay? That's very difficult to imagine, okay? Because you would have to go prior to all of your five main senses, all the conditioning that you've had in life, and that's not easy, right, to do. That's like a really high level type of exploration, okay? And that would be radically different than our normal forms of consciousness. So it would be very different. So imagine now, like, your world and your reality, how much the five senses has shaped that, okay? Your touch, smell, sight, hearing, and taste. In particular, your sight and your hearing, okay? And for example, without your sight and hearing, there's no language, okay? So language has been picked up through others, through communication, through learning symbols, through hearing symbols. So in this place, we're trying to imagine this conscious state, there's not going to be language. That doesn't mean that there isn't like some type of like abstraction or symbols, but it would be very, very different than the type of narratives and memories we have in our mind. Okay? So for us to get a sense of like what this conscious state would be like through direct experience, like we would need to turn off our five senses, first of all, and then observe what the world is like without our five senses. Okay, that's part A. Part B would be we would have to erase all of our prior conditioning, all of our experience that involve the five senses. Okay, both of those would be very challenging. This would be like upper level master expert in terms of like consciousness exploration. Okay, so we might get a little glimpse. So I've done things in like a sensory deprivation tank. Okay, so in that tank, it's not 100% removing senses, but it drastically reduces the senses, and it can allow exploration into different mind spaces. Okay, so, but there can still be appearances that are related to hearing. Like there could be like phantom hearing, there could be like images that occur in the mind that are like related to like sight or hearing. So it doesn't remove your decades of conditioning that involve your senses, okay? But it can give a little bit of a taste of a world where you're not directly taking in information through your senses, okay? So that can provide insight. The other part of removing everything that you've experienced that involves senses is also difficult, but I do think it could be possible in some ways where the brain or what is appearing is not involving that, but this gets like really tricky. So I'm just going to leave it at that this would be really difficult to enter a place that does not involve any of your prior conditioning with the senses. Okay? So, and another thing is that many of our memories involve like a sense of self. Okay? So, if you didn't have any of your senses through your lifetime, okay, you're not going to have a sense of self, okay, of who you are. And, or it would be radically different than what you're familiar with, so radically different, like it wouldn't really be fair to call it a sense of self, okay? So we're considering something that we might not even consider, like it's a very different life form. So it would be living, but it would be a very different life form. And like we could call it human, but it would be very different than what we consider as being human, okay? So much of our sense of self, of who you are, was shaped by things like appearance. Your appearance of what you look like, right? The size of yourself, your height, what you look like, how other people view you, okay? Looking at yourself in a mirror, looking at other people, hearing what other people have to say, you're good at this, you're not good at this, all sorts of cultural type of programming that we've received, and different types of beliefs all shape our sense of self. Okay? Without any of our five main senses, there wouldn't be any of that. Okay? So there wouldn't be a sense of self as we know it. Okay? So the boundaries of our body, right? That involves what we consider as being external to us. So in the realm of non-duality, they talk a lot about that, of setting up, and in things like Buddhism as well, as like a sense of self and a body and how these things are illusions, okay? But part of our sense of self is the body, okay? So there's like a psychological sense of self, but then also the body. So your experience, your aches and pains, what you feel, information that you're taking in, you're hot, you're cold, that all contributes to a sense of self. So it's both this psychological mind space, but also a body where we create these barriers, right? Like, this is where my body ends. Anything inside of this is me. Anything outside of this would not be me. But that's not possible without our five main senses. So there still could be a sense of self, but it would be radically different than what we think. Okay? So now let's consider what might be present that could be a thing, right, where there could be recall that that thing has been observed before, okay? So what might that be without our five senses? Okay, so I'm gonna start like things that we can relate to most easily, and then kind of step back a little bit more, like out there progressively. So the easiest thing to think of, so the question did say no senses, okay? But then it said like touch, smell. So I don't know if this counts or not, but one would be a possibility, and we might be like, no, the rules say we can't use this. But so one possibility would be like internal sensing of like our organs, okay? But not so-called external senses, right? Like this type of like touch, okay? So if there was internal sensing of the organs, then you would have things like internal pains, and there would be all sorts of things that are not another thing. So we wouldn't have that null void. There would be appearances, and there would be awareness of that, okay? Because we've made the assumption that the mind, in this mind, there would still be awareness. As well, like the hippocampus stores memories. So if there was like this impulse of pain in like the colon, and then there was pain in another part of the body, okay? Well, that pain itself is different than no pain. So that's a thing. Then, if there was pain in one area and then another like type of pain in another area, then now we've got the thing of a pain appearing, and we have a new thing of different localization. That one happened here, another happened like here. So the mind, right, even though there isn't this construct of myself and inside of my body, there still could be like spatial construction, right, that a thing appeared here and another thing appeared here, okay? So from a neuroscience perspective, the hippocampus is an area of the brain that's related to storing information about appearances and like recall, okay? So we're assuming that the hippocampus in this entity is going to be functioning. So then if there was another pain, there could be an access to comparing that and contrasting that to the previous appearance of what I'm calling pain. But the processing and what that looks like would be very different, because it wouldn't be something like oh, I'm feeling pain, because there's no I, right? Because there's no like sense of identity, right? Present. So it's hard to imagine like how that would be related to without a sense of I. So it would be awareness of impulses, but not the extra story of like, oh, this is my colon, right? Oh my gosh, right? Like, oh, I shouldn't have eaten something, right? Oh, I have a family history of stomach pains. Is it ever going to go away? Like that type of thing's probably not going to be present, okay? But the question did say, like, there's no sensing, so I might have broken a rule there, okay? So I'm going to move on, okay? Related to that, which we could also consider like a sensing, is proprioception, and that gives, again, like a spatial locality of where the body is in space. And it doesn't require a vision. So it's feedback from the nervous system within your body of three-dimensional space. So if you try to balance, right, and you're trying to get body spatial recognition, with your sight is very important for that. So try to do like a balancing pose in yoga, or just stand on one leg, right, and lift the other leg high. If your eyes are open, it's much easier. If you shut your eyes, it's going to be a lot more difficult, okay? So part of that depends on vision, okay? But not all. So if it was completely dark and you're walking around in a room, you still have some idea of space. If your arm is like way up here, right, you don't have to look at it and be like, okay, my arm is there, okay? There's proprioception information from your nervous system that's about some muscle contractions and where parts of the body are relative to other parts of the body. So would someone without the five senses have this type of unique of appearances, right, that would arise in their consciousness? And I don't know, I'm just saying that that's outside of the five main senses. It's related to them, but it wouldn't count as one of the five main senses, but you could still call that a sense, okay? I'm gonna move on. Other ones that people still call a sense, right? So it's difficult to explore this conversation of like if the rule is like no sense, because then we have to get into like what is a sense, okay? So going a little bit further would be something like intuition, okay? So this is a type of sense that's related to the five main senses, but it's not directly one of them, okay? And most people probably have a sense, like it's closer to a feeling, right, than like thinking. It's going to, your environment and your senses are going to impact that, but that intuition itself, I would say, would have some, we could put that in its own category, okay? Similarly with like emotions, okay? Emotions are related to our senses. So you see things, you're feeling things, right? Like if you're feeling like mosquitoes are on your body and you're feeling bothered, right? Or someone says something to you that makes you angry, or you hear like a joke, or you see something funny and it gives you some joy, okay? So it's very much related and cooperates with our five senses. But I think we could also say that emotions, okay, not like sensing feelings like touch, but like emotions like joy and love and sadness, that we could put them in their own category as well outside of the five senses. Okay, so those parts of the brain we're assuming would still be operative. So there could be forms of emotions that appear, okay, that would be distinct. But then again, with memories, there could be a recognition of of an appearance of an emotion that's happening again, but without the story of I'm angry or I'm feeling sad, okay, that type of thing, or I'm always sad, I don't want to feel sad. So the whole personal story probably wouldn't be there, okay? Uh, Another thing outside of the five senses would be something like sensing a presence. Okay, so have you ever like had the sense that like you were being like watched, right? And like you turn and like there is actually somebody there. Like you didn't hear anything, you didn't see anything, right? Uh, but somehow there was some sensing, and it was just really odd. Okay, or like you're in like you visit like some like old house or something, and like there's just this aura or sense about it. So it's not something you're hearing, not something you're seeing, but there's something that's like a sixth type of sense. Okay? Uh, Something like deja vu, right? Where there's like this sense like I've been here before, right? So it's related to seeing things like this looks like familiar, like to me. I think I've been here, okay? But that feeling, that or that sense of deja vu, we could say is related to the other senses, but we could also put it in a category, okay, on its own. So now the human mind, in terms of like our survival, the types of interactions we have through our day, by far relies on the five main senses. Okay, in particular, touching, uh, sight, and hearing. Okay, so other forms of perception that we might have, like intuition, sensing, presence, uh, we could have a much higher capacity for that and potential for that, become really advanced at it, but we're just consumed with our other senses, right? And you got a job, right? You got to go to work, you got to go to school, you've got these responsibilities, right? We're get distracted like online and social media, that we're not, it's not something that's commonly discussed and cultivated. But now imagine that like you went out, say like in the wilderness for like a year, and you were going to dive deep in just trying to tune in to your sensing presence and intuition. Okay, you might get really good at it. Okay, and if we go back in time before we had like modern technology, like ancient tribes, they worked a lot more with intuition, where in terms of like their hunting and their gathering, and they worked a lot more with like sensing presence. Okay, and so this also gets in the idea of like, well, were they just hallucinating a lot of these presents, or was it real? But that's not the point here. The point is that that's an appearance, and that's a manifest. That is a thing that we could say is a different category than the five main senses. Okay, and so if somebody was born and their whole life they didn't have the five senses, there could be other things that we occasionally get glimpses into that they get really good at. okay, and develop that at a very, very high level, okay? As well, parts of their brain that aren't being used. There's a couple possibilities here. So something like the visual system or the auditory system is not being used. Could all of that hardware be used for something else? And this also gets a little tricky. And I would say yes, but there's going to be probably some limitations. So there's a long history of evolution where that wiring is kind of hardwired. So the visual system, there's the visual cortex in your occipital lobe, right? That is wired with information that comes through your eyes. Okay, so there's different wavelengths of light, right, that excites our retinal cells. Okay, and then there's a lot of there's different types of neurotransmitters that are released, and neuronal signaling and action potentials, so on and so forth. Goes through the thalamus, goes to the occipital lobe and our visual cortex. Okay, and we have millions of years of evolution where that, to an extent, is hardwired. So I could see that if that's not being used, it could just kind of die. And like other parts of the brain, because there's a lot of parts of the brain like that just aren't very active. Okay, we use a small percentage of the brain. So if someone didn't have the five senses, I could see parts of the brain that we don't utilize very much becoming very advanced. Okay, and parts of the brain, like the auditory cortex and visual cortex, just dying out. But I could also see that machinery being used in a different way, but with limitations, okay? So because it's kind of hardwired for sight, okay? So I don't imagine something totally new like developing. Okay, so this gets into what's called plasticity, is in one's like lifetime, how plastic is the potential. So like how much room like for adaptation is there? Okay, so within your life, there's a certain range, for example, of height, okay, that you, depending on the environment, right, in your diet, like you could have grown a little bit taller, a little bit, like you could have been smaller. Okay, let's go taller, but within certain limits. Okay, you're not going to grow to being 12 feet tall. Okay, so that would be outside the plasticity within one person's lifetime. But in evolutionary time, that could be evolved, okay, over like millions of years if there was a selective pressure. So maybe like AI gets really advanced and there's a selective pressure just to be like really like tall that's selected for, okay, but it would take a long time, okay, of evolution. So similarly with the visual cortex, I could see it contributing to other things, but not like it's going to do something totally new. Okay, just like you can't just become a kangaroo. Okay, like there are certain limits structurally. Okay, but I think there would be potential for things to start to get like rewired to an extent. Okay, and now along the lines of accessing parts of the brain that are underutilized. So I gave some examples of like intuition, like sensing a presence, that we all probably have moments that like we can relate to that, okay? But now let's look at it in a different context, okay? So one would be, there's cases where people get injured, okay, in particular in the temporal lobe, right? So somebody like died and like they hit their head like really hard here and have like a fairly severe like injury. Quite often that causes damage that's not good, and there's loss of abilities, but sometimes there's gains of an ability, okay? So there's been cases such as someone having a traumatic injury like that, and this person had no musical experience, had never picked up a musical instrument, walked to a piano and started playing the piano, okay, at expert level, as if they had practiced and trained for their entire life, okay? So there was something there that got unlocked, okay? And so this starts to get into some interesting like metaphysics, like epigenetics, like past lives, about things that are like encoded in our DNA, like prior to our birth. Like where did that come from? So it's thought that, like from a neuroscience perspective, that maybe there's like pathways in our brain that are possible, but they just get repressed because we've got other stuff going on, right? And we use like different types of pathways. But we could also think about things from like an epigenetic perspective and maybe like a past life perspective as well. So epigenetics is more like the science of this, where prior, like your parents in particular, like your mother, her experiences and what she took in, that alters gene expression, right? And you're familiar with this yourself. If you have a really stressful environment, you start turning on stress-related genes, okay? But different types of environmental impacts of our ancestors, that can affect which genes get turned on and turned off. It's not going to affect pretty much it's not going to affect the DNA sequence, but it can affect which genes are turned on and which genes are turned off. And we know that that can be inherited from one generation to another. Okay, so part of your gene expression, okay, that there was information that was passed on, okay, from your parents. So there could be possibilities that music in this context has just been an integral form of the human experience for a really long time, right? So for hundreds of thousands of years at least, probably like maybe like even Neanderthals probably had like some type of like rudimentary types of like drumming. So it's possible that there's like wisdom or knowledge like about music that we just don't access, but it's possible, okay? So that would be one possible explanation for someone that like had a traumatic injury and like all of a sudden like can play the piano flawlessly like an expert, okay? Like they have no muscle memory, like there's some type, we could also consider that a form of memory, right? Of like, oh yeah, I can play the piano, right? Like, and just like playing it, and it feels natural. Like it might be shocking, like, oh my God, like I'm an expert at the piano now. But it probably would also feel natural just doing it. Like I just know how to do this, okay? So to bring this back to an entity, a life form that never had the senses, that there could be things that through human evolution, right, has been inherited, some forms of memory, right, that because that life form is not getting conditioned through our five senses and forming a sense of self, right, it doesn't have those types of restrictions of like, oh, well, I was born this particular day, this particular year, this is who I am, you know, my childhood looked like this, so on and so forth. Like they don't have any of those restrictions, right, any of those limitations. So it could be possible that things that are locked for us would not be for that life form, okay? So that is possible, okay? And another would be appearances in consciousness that we can't imagine, okay? So there are things that we can't imagine. So there are different sense. We are not aware of everything, okay? That's possible. So there are things that, and you probably know this in your own experience, like that there's things you aren't aware of that you become aware of in your life, okay? Like if you travel to a foreign culture, there would be things like, wow, I didn't know that. Like I wasn't aware that that existed, okay? Similarly, there's ways of relating to reality that an individual person is not aware of, that's just radically different. So if somebody took a particular substance, like magic mushrooms or something, that could like alter perception like so radically, and then give insight to states of consciousness that the person was not aware like existed, and comes back and was like, oh my god, like what just happened? Okay, so there are like, phenomena or stuff that we would just be like unaware of, which is just, and it's hard to speculate like what that would be because we're unaware of it, right? But then that could be something like to open the mind of like where you ask questions and you're open-ended and you're curious of like what could be new things that I'm not aware of, right? And something new like might just appear, okay? So I think that's quite a bit of exploration. So I think I'll end here. And if you guys had like any comments or had other types of questions that you kind of like me to contemplate. So again, like it's not like a definitive answer. Like I just brought up like possibilities today rather than having like a hardcore, like this is the answer, period. Okay? Some people kind of like that, right? Other people are like, I just watched this video and there's no answer, like at the end. Okay? Some people don't like that at all. But other people like the exploration. So if you like this type of thing and you're like, hey, could you do this for like this type of question or this type of thing? Maybe, sure. I like this type of consciousness work. So I do a lot of like consciousness exploration, and some of it is building constructs like this, and then deconstructing it and like building, and then again like everything that I created. This is just one way of doing it. So if some point along the way, like when I was talking about like a sense of self, you're like, oh, the sense of self is an illusion, it doesn't really exist. It's like, you're right. Like I could totally like go with that it's an illusion, but it's also real. So I can go both ways, right? So you might have had ways that you use particular terms or things in a different way, and I would be open to exploring that as well. All right, so I think I'm gonna end it here. Bye-bye.